Welcome in Behind the Plate with Maren and Nate, and with Maren Angus Combs, the softball writer for the Huskers page on SI.com. I'm Nate Rohr, the play-by-play voice of Nebraska softball. We have a special episode for you here, the bracketology episode, as we are down to the last week of the regular season. The Huskers lost a pair of games to Northwestern, one close, one a blowout, and then game 3, Nebraska raced out to a 5-0 lead in 3 innings. And then the rains came and they just didn't stop, and we were not able to resume the game, make the game official, and get Nebraska a big win over Northwestern. But Maren, we have a special guest. That's Eric Lopez. He is a longtime media dignitary in college softball, and he hosts his own podcast in the Circle. He also is the leading bracketologist for D1 softball, and so he's got a good feel for everything going on and how the regionals will set up. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Nate. Good to talk to you as always. Same with you, Maren. We've known each other, I feel like 100 years, so it's good. It's good. Postseason's around the corner, but it's fun.
Yeah, as you've kind of tried to put together the bracket and go through the field, I mean, obviously a down year for the Big Ten Conference, looking like 3 teams at most out of the Big Ten. What do you ascribe what looks to be a down year for the league?
It's been a strange year. I think youth is a big part of it. I mean, think of all the seniors and the experience you lost the league did as a year ago from graduation, from transfer. That's, to me, has been a big factor. I feel like this has been a rebuilding year for the Big Ten, because I think if you look ahead to next year, I think the Big Ten next year with UCLA and Oregon, Washington, hopefully the return of Jordy Ball healthy, the Big Ten, I think, will bounce back next year and be a top 4 league potentially as we get in moving forward. But I feel like this year they're taking some lumps, some youth. Northwestern had replaced a lot of talent. Minnesota had to replace their pitching, which it's been up and down with them. So I think youth has been a big part of why the league's down a little bit. And look, the league took some lumps in the non-conference, losing some games that they probably wish they hadn't. And I think that's kind of brought down some of the league as well. I don't think the bottom of the league is as good as was, say, a year ago in the Big Ten. So I think a combination of those things, Nate, have contributed to, like, Wisconsin. We're not used to seeing Wisconsin this down like they are, but they're certainly lacking pitching. I saw them in Clearwater. And so I think that's hurt the quality of depth from the Big Ten that they've had maybe the last few years as a result. But, that being said, I think this makes it interesting next couple of weeks in the Big Ten, because you mentioned right now I have certainly 3 teams in, but the Big Ten tournament in Iowa, that could get crazy. Like, somebody could easily steal a bid there and add to the league. I think there's a lot of fascinating storylines when we get to the Big Ten championships there in Iowa.
Do you think, though, that say a 4 seed on down, I mean, Nebraska's a 6 seed right now. We're looking potentially for the Big Ten tournament. But if someone does steal a bid for the Big Ten, will the 3 teams you have in stay in?
I think it'll depend on how they do, right? Like, I think Northwestern, of all the Big Ten teams, is a lot, regardless of what happens. I think Northwestern has the best resume. I think they're the one team that, to me, feels comfortable. I think Penn State, as long as they don't lose early in the Big Ten tournament, I think they're in as well. They got some good resume wins. After that, it gets really interesting. Nebraska, for example. Nate, I mean, you're listening to you talking about that rainout game. That is huge. Like, that would have been a massive win for Nebraska. If they win that game, they're probably in the conversation for 64 or 65 right now. This is a soft bubble this year. This is not a strong bubble like years past. Normally in years past, you would have some mid-major teams in the mix with some power conferences, and you have 5-6 teams to pick from. That's not the case this year. You're talking Ole Miss, who's in last in the SEC, Utah and their bad RPI, who's in the set bottom of the Pac-12. To me, if Nebraska, and I don't have to tell you, Nate, obviously, you guys all follow Nebraska, a couple of results differences, and you're on the positive side right now of the tournament. I think Nebraska still can get in if they make a run to the Big Ten championship game and not necessarily win it, because they're right now in one of my first 4 out. I don't think that'll be at the expense, though, of another Big Ten team. I think that would be at the expense of an Ole Miss, potentially, maybe one of the Big 12 teams. I'm not, especially, I think Northwestern is the most secure. I think Penn State's a little tier after that. Michigan has probably been playing the best softball. They dug themselves a hole early in the year, but I kind of feel like they're the second best team. So I think they would get in as well. So I don't think it'll necessarily be at the expense of the Big Ten, but you never know with committees.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Michigan probably. Northwestern's you're solid. Northwestern's been the best wire to wire, but then Michigan, with the way they have played over really since the Northwestern sweep, they've really turned a corner, and that's pretty impressive to see. And even I think RPI wise they're pretty secure, but even if they weren't, I think they would have the strong finish component going for them, wouldn't they? As the committee considers them,
No doubt. And I would argue maybe the best non-conference wins. They have 2 wins over Florida, which is looking really good right now for them. That's going to be tough to top and keep them out from that standpoint. So I tend to agree with you. I think they're right now in the mid-30s as we talk in the RPI. You look at their wins resume-wise, they have the best, I think, quad 1 wins of all the Big Ten teams. The thing they just got off to that bad start where they lost some games on the West Coast that you're like shaking your head, and talking to Coach Bonnie told they just couldn't score. Right?
Yeah.
Their offense really was struggling for such a long time. The pitching was good enough. She liked their staff, but their offense, it took them a while to get going. But it seems to me, what's been the difference in conference plays, that their offense has awoken, and it really set the tone when they swept Indiana, which is significant. I think that turned the tide for both teams from a postseason standpoint. So you're absolutely right. I think Michigan, I feel pretty good about. Like Michigan, Penn State, as long as Penn State doesn't lose early, as long as Michigan doesn't lose a game that shakes your head, I do feel that the Big Ten at least will get 3 bids in, which is good. There was times this year where I wondered, could they get 2 in? But they've played themselves to at least 3.
When you mention a team like Indiana, you really think Taryn Kern made this team the team that they were last year compared to this year?
That's a good question. She hasn't lighted up at Stanford, but maybe they miss her a little bit. Indiana's been a weird team this season. They've got 4 quad 2 wins. They had a win over Oregon. They did all their resume work in Clearwater to start the year. I think they thought more about their pitching with the experience that they had coming back would be more of an advantage. My concern with Indiana, 100 schedule strength overall, 136 non-conference. That's not good. They got 3 quad 3 losses, a quad 4 loss. Their average RPI win is 147. And this is a big weekend for them. They must get something against Northwestern. If they do not, I think they're going to have to at least probably win the Big Ten tournament to get in. That resume is not good. And losing that series to Wisconsin was a killer for them. But do they miss Kern? I don't know if they miss Kern as much. I just think they don't, it's tough to duplicate what you did last year. Players are different. Maybe some of the players are not having the years they thought they would have when I spoke to Coach Stanton before the season. Because they've had times where they've looked like they didn't miss a beat without her. But I just think it's one of those things where teams now, I don't know I'm not going to say teams didn't take them serious last year, but now people are circling Indiana every time they're playing. They're getting everybody's best game. I think that's something they're getting used to.
Chatting with Eric Lopez, a longtime softball broadcaster here on Behind the Plate with Maren and Nate, and he's also the D1softball.com bracketologist, in addition to hosting his own podcast in the Circle. Excellent. I recommend it highly. Okay, you talk about Indiana and what they need to do to keep at-large bids alive. Let's talk about what Nebraska needs to do. You mentioned that it may still be a possibility for Nebraska to get an at-large if they make a deep run in the Big Ten tournament. What do they need to do this week to kind of keep the lights on and give themselves a chance going out to Iowa City for the Big Ten tournament?
Win the series against Minnesota. And that's the weird thing about the Big Ten, right? If years pass, if I said just win the series against Minnesota, that's going to improve your resume. Unfortunately, Minnesota is down this year with their pitching being young and everything. So you're not getting the credit of teams like that. So if you're Nebraska, just win the series, get to the Big Ten tournament, get yourself a good seed. You're actually, and I know we're focusing about the Big Ten seeding and everything, you're almost better off being in a draw where you're playing Penn State, for example, or Michigan, where you can help your resume as you go through the tournament. It doesn't help you if you make a run in the Big Ten tournament and you're playing teams that are at RPI in the 70s or 80s, for example. So you actually would be better off being in a tougher draw, but getting through that draw, because then your resume blows up and it gets up for Nebraska. But, look at Nebraska. Good schedule strength, 30th non-conference schedule strength, 38th overall, 4 quad 2 wins. The thing that's biting them is those 4 quad 3 losses and a quad 4 loss that they have this season, and no quad 1 wins. Tough combination there. That's why they're down. If they turn a couple of those games, and Nate, I'm just going to defer to you because you saw every game. Yeah. Change 2-3 results, we're having a different conversation. But I got them in my first 4 out. And again, it's a soft bubble. I think if Nebraska makes a run, makes it to the Big Ten title game, let's say, knocked off a Penn State or knocked off a Michigan, somebody like that on the way, now all of a sudden you might sneak in there as the last team, which would be a pretty impressive feat for Rhonda Revelle and company, considering the injuries that they've had. Jordy Ball obviously is the more notable injury. I mean, that's a killer because you don't replace Jordy Ball in the circle, and clearly Nebraska struggled a little bit with that. But they've had other injuries that you both know well about. It's been a tough season for Nebraska across the board with the injuries. And yet to be still in this position, to have a chance to make the tournament, I think speaks volumes to Coach Revelle and the job she's done there with all the adversity they've had this year.
Yeah. I think there's like 7 injuries at this point. It's truly insane. And then when we talk about the pitching, we talk about who they could potentially play in the Big Ten tournament. Nate, I mean, if they were to play Michigan, if they were to play Penn State, they played both of those teams really well.
Right. Yep. It lines up for them. I guess the question that pops into my head, especially with Penn State, to an extent with Michigan, can you undo some damage done by getting swept in a series or losing a series? If Nebraska were to play a Michigan in the Big Ten semis, which would be a pretty likely scenario, or they play Penn State in the semis or even the quarters, and Nebraska lost the Penn State series at home. They were swept by Michigan out there. Can you undo some of the damage of that, of what happened in the regular season in the league tournament?
You can. You could do some of that because let's say you play Michigan and you beat them. Now you've just picked up a top 40 RPI win. So you're going to help you. It's going to help you from a resume standpoint and pick up quality wins. That's the key. You want to get quality wins. If you don't win the automatic bid, which is the obvious, easiest path, just win the tournament, you're in. But if you can't do that, pick up some quality wins. That's why the SEC has had this advantage on everybody, because when they get to the SEC tournament, every game, it seems like it's a top 40 RPI game. So that's why a lot of times, Maren, you've covered this in the past with Ole Miss, when they make the run to the SEC championship game, magically they host because they pick up 3-4 top 40 wins there. You've seen that with Missouri recently do that. So South Carolina got a 2 seed because they made a run to the championship game. So pick up quality wins is a big bonus there from that standpoint for Nebraska. So absolutely, Nate, if you could get a win or 2 there, that could make the difference where the committee sits in the room and say, look, Nebraska got to the Big Ten final, whereas maybe a bubble team like Kansas got knocked out in the opening round of the Big 12 tournament, or maybe Ole Miss got knocked out in the opening round of the SEC tournament. That might help them. Now, the other thing we don't know is, are there some bid stealers out there that could also take up some spots? So if you're Nebraska, you do not want, for example, the American to potentially get a 3rd bid outside of maybe a Charlotte or FAU or a Sunbelt, somebody other than Louisiana, Texas State, or South Alabama to win a tournament. That's the other factor that you have to take in, because that'll take up a spot or 2. But for Nebraska, yes, with the schedule strength you have, the schedule strength is good enough to get you in, and that's something the committee looks at. It's just adding to that resume, maybe picking up a couple wins and show that, hey, we're maybe deserving of being one of those field of 64.
Well, I think while we're talking about Nebraska players in Nebraska, Eric, I think you just had the Groff twins on your show.
Yep.
And that is actually some info for everyone. Maddie Groff was recruited to Nebraska. However, Rhonda did not want both of them, and they're a package deal. So SIU got them. And just what do you think about this mid major? She's a star, and I mean SIU obviously is a lock to get in.
Yeah, they're dominating the Valley right now, and Maddie is a big-time pitcher, freshman pitcher, just got named top 25 freshman finalist of the year for the NFCA. And if you listen to the interview, just glad you brought it up on the In the Circle podcast. She came on with her twin sister, Rylan. And they both said, look, it wasn't like from the beginning they were going to just be a package deal. It just kind of played out that way. The more they looked at their options, they're like, why don't we just keep playing together? And they're both very happy about that. She gives Rylan a lot of credit for her success being a solid catcher. And Rylan, obviously, they just have that great chemistry with Rylan calling the pitches in that staff with Jen Sewell. That's been a big thing that's worked for them. So it's been huge for Jen Sewell. Jen Sewell I talked to says this is the best arm she's ever coached at Southern Illinois. They're going to be a dangerous 3 seed to wherever they end up, which is probably going to be either Missouri or Arkansas because they could bust there. We don't want to get into the whole 400-mile radius stuff. We talked about that for years ad nauseum, our favorite topic. But they are really legitimate good. And that's a team that could shut you down. And I'm telling you, if you're looking for a team that could pull an upset or two in a regional and say, whoa, how did they end up there in the regional final? That's a team to watch because I've seen she has an amazing changeup. Having seen her play, which is impressive against Belmont. And they take a lot of pride coming from the state of Nebraska and representing as well. That they're very open about that. And they're very happy there at SIU. They love the culture there. And they want to raise the bar for mid-major programs. That's the other thing they told me in the podcast interview. But 2 young, wonderful ladies that have a bright future ahead.
We're chatting with Eric Lopez here on Behind the Plate with Maren and Nate. And you talk about mid-major, the possibilities for mid-majors, and especially in the landscape we're moving into, where so much of the power in college athletics, let alone softball, is going to be consolidated in the SEC and the Big Ten. What does the path forward look like for not just a program like SIU, which is on the come, but you think of these Sunbelt teams, Louisiana, excuse me. They prefer to be known as Louisiana. I don't need any Raging Cajuns after me. But Louisiana, Texas State, even some of these American schools that are in it year in, year out, we're moving into a place where the SEC effect is only going to get stronger as they add Texas and Oklahoma, and the Big Ten all of a sudden gets that. How do those schools find their way forward to where they can get an at-large bid to regionals?
It is a fantastic question. I think it's a question that many are asking within the sport. I think it's a question that certainly remains to be seen. Big Ten's going to grow, as you both know, UCLA, Oregon, Washington. SEC is going to get Oklahoma and Texas. The Big 12 is going to get Arizona, Utah, Arizona State. You have teams like UCF, who has been a solid mid-major for many years, now a power conference team. Houston's a power. So you're taking away some of the top mid-major programs that are going to power leagues. That shrinks that even more. And now you're going to have these leagues at 13, 14, 15 teams. How many teams is a committee going to let an SEC get in? Are they going to try to get all 13 or 14 teams in, or 11, 12? That remains to be seen. You're right. It's a lot harder. We're seeing it a little bit already this year, where right now, I think the American and the Sun Belt are the only mid-majors guaranteed to probably have at least 1 or 2 at-large spots. After that, it's kind of up in the air. It's a little thinner than it was, say, a year ago. I do wonder if there's a smaller room, room for error for the mid-majors. And I've heard some chatter I mean, we've heard this on basketball, but I've heard some of the people at softball are thinking of expanding the tournament, which
Hmm.
I don't I don't know what I feel about that, but that
Hmm.
could be another thing that's, and part of the problem is this is all started with football, and then it
Yep.
kind of triggers to basketball, and then it seems like every other sport follows that. So I'm worried football's expanding their playoff. There's been talk about whether men's basketball and women's basketball is going to expand the tournament. I'm worried if they do end up expanding the basketball tournament that you might see baseball and softball follow suit, because that's usually how this works. I don't like it, but that could be
Yep.
the direction because these power conferences want to grab more of the piece of the pie, and that could leave out more teams in the mid. And that's unfortunate because you both know this. There's a team like Omaha this year that's
Sure.
really good with Cameron Myers, South Dakota State in the Summit with Tori Kanish. They got arms. You got mid majors in softball that can compete at a high level. But now it's like you're putting more obstacles against these programs to be successful. And then there's the financial side of things where maybe a lot of these top head coaches, you wonder if they leave, not necessarily to just be a head coach at a power conference league, but maybe become an assistant at a power conference league. So I do worry about that, Nate, a lot about the impact of that moving forward as we head into this new landscape that of college athletics.
I say if they decide to expand the field, have the power conference teams play each other. Maybe if you're playing for a 2 seed, maybe you got to have two SEC teams play against each other. Hey, that I like that idea.
Well, and the other question is going to be: do they try to do away with? There's a rule where two teams from the same conference cannot be in the same regional. Is that still going to be in play? Are they going to try to tweak that because there's so many teams from a particular conference? Do they change that to give them more flexibility? I don't know, but those are some conversations. I know I just had the committee chairperson a few weeks ago on In the Circle, and he acknowledged there has been some conversations behind the scenes taking place about what the tournament will look like, because it's going to get more complicated now.
Sure.
In the future with all these SEC teams if they're in the mix or Big Ten teams in the mix. It's going to be very tricky from that standpoint, from a scheduling standpoint. So it's going to be interesting because I know a lot of fans complain about the committee. The committee has told me this the last few years. They do not look at regular season standings because everybody's playing imbalanced schedules in the conference. And as these conferences get bigger, that's going to be more and more the case. So it makes it a little, they really treat it more as an at-large teams than they do at the standings. And I don't like that, but the way the conferences are growing, that might be the only way to do it.
Yeah, you might. It's not like you can sit there and say, hey, these conference standings definitively tell me the
Right.
best team in the conference is this, the second best, and so on, because it is very subject to your draw, and it's only going to become more so as the years go on, where the no plays increase, and you're talking about not seeing some of your conference every year, and even 2 years or even 4 years. So it just becomes tougher to use the conference standings as sort of a metric,
Well,
even though it makes a lot of sense.
well, and think of the Big Ten moving forward, and maybe you two have more insight than I do. But how is the Big Ten schedule going to look like? How do you evaluate a Big Ten team that maybe has UCLA on their schedule or has
Sure.
Washington on their schedule versus a Big Ten team that maybe doesn't have UCLA or Washington on a schedule, as an example? That's going to be interesting how that formula gets made to try to increase the Big Ten's chances of getting more teams in the field. You're going to have a team that might look up in the standings and like, wow, they're really good. And then you look at it, it's like, well, they didn't play UCLA or they didn't play Oregon. So a team that might be better than them are more in the bottom because they had a tougher schedule within the conference, which
Sure.
I think we may get to the point where we may have to do like a rankings within the conference. How they do conference schedules and non-conference schedule. Do literally a conference schedule strength. Who have the strongest conference schedule in the Big Ten versus weakest? We might get to that point.
Yeah, you would almost have to balance that out and parse that out, because otherwise you're not getting the full picture there as to what the team is. I want to ask you a couple of quick ones. Big 12 conference, as you mentioned, Kansas is a team that's on the bubble. You also have Texas Tech in the upper 30s. what's your percent? You've gotten a closer look at the Big 12
Yeah.
this year as you cover UCF primarily. What's your perception of the Big 12, and what do you see especially with Tech and KU?
It's the deepest it's been in a long time, maybe since Nebraska was in. I believe some people at Big 12 told me that those teams they ever got was 8 in like 2011, right around that time
Mhm.
frame. So they're hoping to get 7 in. We'll see about that. There's depth in the league. I've talked to all the coaches of the Big 12. This is the deepest they've been in a long time. Case in example, Oklahoma losing to BYU. Case in
Yeah,
point, Oklahoma State losing a series to Iowa State. Case in point, a Houston team with no pitching beating Texas. So that never happened the last few years in the Big 12. It was pretty much the Big Three and maybe Baylor, and that's it. Kansas trying to make the tournament for the first time since 2015. Casey Hamilton, they got good arms. They're kind of leaking right now. They're going to play BYU. That's a must-win series for them. Otherwise, they could be on the outside looking in. Texas Tech's got a tall order playing Texas. Craig Snyder's done a nice job there. But the thing I've noticed, and I'll be going to Oklahoma City to cover the Big 12 championships in OKC next week, the depth of the league. There's more quality arms that they've had before in the Big 12. Even Baylor, with all the injuries and the issues they've had, they still got 2 solid arms. Everybody's got quality arms there, except maybe Texas Tech and Houston, but they can rake.
yeah,
That's been the difference. UCF with Sarah Willis just held Oklahoma to 2 hits on Saturday. The first pitcher to go 7 innings, give up 2 hits against that Oklahoma offense in 2 years, since 2022. So there's more depth in the Big 12. They're the number 2 conference according to the RPI. Can they get 7? Will it be 6? I think it's going to be in that range. That Big 12 tournament will decide that. Texas Tech can score with anybody. They're pitching suspect. Kansas can pitch with teams. They're not explosive offensively. That's why Kansas is limping. But the big story is I think OU and Texas are national title contenders. UCF is still solid. A lot of experience from a team that was in the Super Regionals 2 years ago. So it's been a strong year for the Big 12 in this one-off. It's a one-off because OU and Texas are moving on,
sure,
and then they're going to add more teams from the Pac-12 next year. So this is like a one-year deal with everybody. But it's been fun. It's been fun to cover that
sure.
for them, and that's what they're pushing for. Is they think this is going to be the best year from a tournament bid standpoint in over a decade.
I think with Oklahoma and Texas leaving the league and who's replacing them, I don't see the same like power numbers, right? Coming in. Like how does that affect the Big 12 next year when they lose their top 2 teams that are ranked 1 and 2 for primarily the entire season and replace them with Arizona, Utah, more they're still top 25 teams, but they're not number 1 and number 2.
Right. They're not Oklahoma, Texas. That's where the SEC will just get even stronger. Good luck to all the SEC teams there, the Ole Misses and the Mississippi States now that all of a sudden, like, oh, just what we need. So those 2 teams in. I will say this. Arizona is interesting. They're having a bounce back year with Caitlin Lowe this year. They're going to make the NCAA tournament. Utah was in the World Series a year ago. Arizona State's in a bit of a rebuild. Oklahoma State is still a powerhouse. I think the Big 12 and the Big 10 might compete for that number 2 spot behind the SEC.
Mhm.
I think we could all acknowledge the SEC is going to be number 1 with the additions of OU, Texas. I don't think anybody can argue that. But I think that's going to be the fascinating thing is the Big 12 and the Big 10 from a softball. UCLA, Washington, Oregon going to the Big 10, adding hopefully a healthy Nebraska team next year. With Northwestern, who I think is ahead of the curve. Northwestern, to me, what a job. We haven't talked enough about them and the job that the Drohans have done this year. They literally had to rebuild that roster.
Yeah, pretty much everything.
And if winning the Big 10 title, they've done a magnificent job. And the Big 12. I think there will be the debate about who's the second best conference behind their ACC. Is going to be a lot of questions about what the future holds for the ACC. They're going to add Cal and Stanford. We'll see. But to me, the Big 12 can still be very strong and do very well, especially if Houston can kind of step up and get back, to be relevant. They haven't been in the last few years. It'll be interesting to see what happens there in Houston. But I think the Big 12 will be strong, and I think the Big 10 will be strong, and I think that will be the big debate. I could see us doing this a year from now. We're arguing about which conference is better behind the SEC and getting more bids in. It's going to be weird to say, as we'll be breaking down UCLA versus, Rutgers, a Big 10 series, or Illinois, or
Yes.
breaking down, Arizona versus Baylor Big 12. It's going to be weird. We may have to look at our notes to make sure we got it correct a few times, but I still think the Big 12 will be strong. But to your point, Maren, the wild card is Arizona. What kind of Arizona program will they be in the Big 12? Will they be something close to what Kendrea built? Will it be a little lower than that? Plus, will they embrace the Big 12? Will Utah and Arizona State embrace the Big 12? Or are they going to be like, oh, man, I miss the Pac-12? That's going to be the interesting transition. How do they embrace it? Do they go and in, or are they kind of like, I'm not a fan of it? That's going to be interesting to see how those teams follow suit. And I think that applies to the Big Ten. How do those Pac schools come into the Big Ten? Do they come in with arrogance? Do they come in complacent? Or do they come in and excited? Because everybody in the Big Ten is going to try to raise their game to beat them. How do the UCLA's, Washington, Oregon approach the Big Ten? I'm fascinated to see how everybody figures this out starting next year.
And I can tell you from experience, UCLA, Washington, and Oregon are in for a bit of an awakening because, even in 2012, when Nebraska came Big 12 to Big 10, Nebraska, it was a step down in terms of conference, but you underestimate all the things that change. And you're living it right now with UCF, Eric, where all that data you had built up about every conference team, their whole roster, even just the logistics of the games, where you stay, where you eat, where you warm up, that's pretty much out the window. And now it just resets you. Hey, Washington, Oregon, and UCLA are going to come into this league, and I think most people will pick them 1, 2, 3 in some sort of order. I caution everybody against the thought that they're going to run roughshod against the Big Ten, in part because of the quality of conference, but also because of the ask of the big change from what you've known as a program to what they'll be facing next year.
The routine you're used to is gone.
Yep.
And that takes a while. And I've seen that up close with UCF. To your point, you're right. It used to be UCF, you're used to, we'll play a Memphis or a Tulsa. We know that trip. We know the competition, what it is. They're not this year. They've got a rude awakening. Every weekend feels like a regional. That's the words I've gotten. Different arms, different style of play is another thing that coaches have to adjust to. If you're UCLA, Oregon, you're not used to playing Northwestern and Evanston or playing Nebraska and Lincoln. That's going to be adjustment period. And there's going to be pressure because everybody's just going to, like you said, they're going to assume, they're going to run roughshod. Well, what happens when you take that punch and you lose? It's like, how are you going to handle a long flight? Also, because as far as I know, most teams fly commercial still in softball. That's a whole other story for another podcast.
Yes.
But now you're traveling. UCF's traveling to Waco. They're traveling to Oklahoma City. It's different than busing to Tampa for a conference matchup. So that all does matter when in this landscape that will affect some of these results just because you're not familiar with it. So it does take you some time, I think, to adjust for everybody. I think that's a fair point, Nate.
It'll be interesting to watch, and you'll help us keep that straight once it comes, but you're also keeping us aware and on the straight and narrow and prepared for what we're about to see the last weekend of the regular season and also the conference tournament week. Eric Lopez, a UCF softball broadcaster, longtime media maven in college softball, has his own podcast, In the Circle, and the bracketologist on d1softball.com. Eric, thanks for the time. It'll be a fun finish to this season.
It's always a pleasure, Nate and Maren. Thanks for having them on. Always fun to talk some softball. So hopefully we have a fun stretch here with mayhem around the corner.
Absolutely. Sounds good, Eric. So there you go. That's kind of the national picture. And again, we thank Eric for joining us. And it's going to be a compelling final week in the regular season in the Big Ten. Northwestern with a half-game lead on Michigan. Those are your only two combatants still alive in the Big Ten championship race, but we're still battling for top 4 seeding and everything else. And we'll wrap it up next week for you here on Behind the Plate. And for Maren Angus Combs, I'm Nate Rohr. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week as we prepare for the Big Ten tournament.